Bonnitta, it's really great to have you on the channel. We've met and spoken about these kind of topics a few times before, and we've just started a new series called the Collective Intelligence series. And there's a lot of really interesting work being done in this area. And I really like, you sent me a note kind of looking at there's lots of different definitions. The word collective intelligence is often used maybe imprecisely or for many different types of intelligence. And I know that you specialize particularly in the one that I'm most interested in, which is kind of an emergent group practice and creating a kind of collective intelligence that's more than the sum of its parts. But maybe we can just outline what the distinctions are and how the term is sometimes used before we go into the particulars of that kind of collective intelligence.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You know, it's a big field, and there's a lot of different experiments going on, which is really exciting. But for me, I think it's probably timely to try to make sense of some of the conceptual territory, because we're starting to get people dialoguing and their context are slipping, and this always creates tension and then disagreement, and it would be really disastrous if the field split up along these lines that are just definitional. So I thought that was important for me anyways to start with. And you know, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, like, collective intelligence is the word you're using for broadly defined. And I was thinking, if like we were aliens on another planet and we were watching like people from like a petri dish, we would say, wow, there's so much collective intelligence. You know, in fact, over the history of our species, our geosocial spaces have become more and more unified, more and more systematic, more and more interdependent, more and more collective intelligence. Fewer, you know, we used to have a lot of tribes, now we only have a handful of nations. We used to have a lot of trading currencies, now we only really have one neoliberal global market. So from that perspective, we've done this beautiful, quote unquote, job of excelling at collective intelligence. And it actually scares us now, right? Because we know if society or civilization breaks down, none of us know how to do anything without being part of this collective system, this collectively ongoing system.
Yeah, I really liked in the message you sent the idea of no one knows how to build an airplane. That was a really good example of what that means, what that kind of, almost like, would you describe that as swarm intelligence?
Yeah, so the term we would use could use as swarm intelligence or hive mind. And, you know, some of the people doing work in this field throw that term out like that's what the work is for, as if we need to put effort into that trajectory.
Could we just unpack the airplane metaphor? I mean, it just
yeah. So it's even worse than that. I mean, we don't even know how to feed ourselves, right? Or we couldn't even grow our own food or make our own clothes. Or, you know, someone once wrote, nobody knows how to make a pencil, right? There's a lot of people that know how to mine some of this metal, or to get graphite out of wherever it comes from. And some people know how to do the molding, you know, and it goes on and on and on. I look at this thing. I mean, who knows how to build that thing? You know, and more, if you think about it, the trajectory of this kind of swarm intelligence, this systematic operations of intelligence is AI. So pretty soon even people won't know how to do that, those pieces that we know how to do this. You know, robots and AI will know how to do it. So this trajectory has a lot of momentum. And, you know, I don't think it's what we're talking about. It's not what we're all putting all this effort into practicing, right? So I just wanted to make that distinction, because early on in this work, people were using that as a positive kind of attractor. And so that's one distinction to be made. We can put that aside because even though we have this collective intelligence, we might maybe say that we don't feel particularly connected in terms of relationally connected or intimately connected or have a lot of affection for each other, right? So we have this collective intelligence, but we're certainly missing something that perhaps we had in pre-modern times. And I think that's another distinction to be made, because some of these practices are actually helping us reclaim something we actually had a long time ago, right? And so that's still not an emergent human capacity, but I do think that somehow the emergent capacity and reclaiming this earlier prior capacity, they are dependent upon each other.
You said that that's not the collective intelligence that you think is really relevant. So do you want to talk about what collective intelligence you think is the key one? And what's your background in that? How did you come to be interested in this kind of collective intelligence?
Yeah, so the term I use for what we're trying to achieve, a new emergent capacity, is collective insight practice. And the reason why I call it that is a couple of reasons. So we have, it's similar to practices that are out there that are called we-space practices or circling. Now, circling itself has a very broad range of what people are doing, so I don't want to pigeonhole anyone. But in general, what I've seen is that the purpose of these practices, a lot of the focus is in processing something like psychological or social structures that are limiting, right? So we have our social defenses and our social triggers that limit authentic relationship. And we have psychological structures that limit us being authentic, showing up authentically in groups or having transparent communications, right? So a lot of the practices are at the stage where we have to build the capacity to deconstruct or to resolve these psychological or social structures because they're limiting the way we can participate with each other. So that's another level. That's different than collective intelligence. It's sitting down and kind of working on these limiting structures that both are held by an individual in a group. So I don't know to call that circling or we-space practices. So those are practices that are in service to the human individual, potential of the human individual. So, you know, I'm going to say something probably, you know, I don't mean it to stick to all practices, but a lot of people my age, you know, we see circling and we-space practice coming out of the lineage of T groups, right? Carl Rogers T groups. And those also were part of the human potential movement. You know, can we use a group to potentiate the individual? And one of the things that was interesting, another distinction I'm going to say, is this comes along when people start actually being able to see the structures in society, you know, that they're not pre-given. What was happening is people started to be actually see the structures that were limiting them. And first we saw the social structures and people became activists. And, you know, there was all these protest movements and all this, the 60s and stuff. So that was a certain, also a certain phase in this work. But the new phase is categorically different. And this is where I think the new capacity is coming online. And the new phase is we're very frustrated about the dysfunction in those protest communities and the dysfunction in those social justice communities. They actually enacted the same structures that they were fighting against. And people started to realize that those structures were introjected in them. And to me, that marks the modern age of these practices. So that you have to go back, it's more complex. In order to change the limiting structures that are programmed by society, you have to sit and re-examine, reconnect, first learn how to reconnect, and then you have to work on the fact that those structures are introjected inside your own psyche. And so to me, that marks, and maybe you could say it in, you know, in language that people are more comfortable with, but that marks to me the current new emergent capacity of these practices.
I'd just like to get a really concise definition of what collective insight practice is and what it looks like when people are doing it.
So collective insight practice is a methodology for people to get together and together come up with insights, knowings, plans, mental models, ideas that neither any of them had when they entered together. And it's not just some kind of mashup of clips that people had. It's something that affects people or seems to people as entirely novel and new. And they know they couldn't have come up with that without the participation of other people. They know even the crazy nonlinear streams that they went off with someone in an argument or in a wacky humorous thing, all these somehow played a part in either disrupting the system or moving the energy or creating new pathways for thinking. And that everyone has held a piece for this new paradigm shift or this new way of perceiving or new idea or new approach to have arisen.
Would that link, I mean, what I'm hearing you referring to relative to stuff that we've put out on the channel before is the idea of, for example, that Jordan Greenhall and Daniel Schmachtenberger and others talk about this game B civilization, the non-rivalrous dynamics. And what I hear you saying is that we've internalized a lot of those rivalrous dynamics where when it comes to sort of this kind of game theoretical world or the game A world, we've actually internalized a lot of these. So we're maybe the original activists, we're also playing power games in a way that trying to replace a system, but actually mimicking the worst aspects of that system and sort of corrupt hierarchies. And is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I remember when I originally was talking with Jordan Greenhall at the time about this, he used to call it malware. We're running malware. That's a cool term for the introduction of these structures, right? So, and this is also why you see a lot of meditation practices and metacognitive types of meditations coming online, because you need a metacognitive awareness to be able to look in and see, my God, you know, I'm running malware, I'm running scripts that are part of the external system that I'm running. And by fighting this system, if I'm running those scripts to fight the system, I'm just continuing to build up the system, right? So, and
often worse, because you experience, and probably you've experienced as well, this idea of you go into environments where they say, right, we're going to get rid of hierarchies. And what you end up with is this sort of underground subterranean hierarchy that's far less visible and sometimes far more pathologically enforced than a clear sort of, I mean, in kind of integral terms, you'd say sort of a green space rather than an orange space.
Yeah, so I agree with you. And I think that, you know, the psychological process of introjection is that then you project the enemy out and there's all these overcorrections and shadows and stuff like that. But what you're pointing to is an experience that I had early on in these practices. You know, I came out of business and pretty dynamic companies. And then I started being interested in these practices because Otto Sharma had written his books and all my friends in Integral were doing these practices. And the first ones I went to were like, oh my God, like they're still very over facilitated and there's all this manipulation going on, except we've been really good, much better at manipulating. And I would rather have someone just be aggressive or just be, an asshole, then have that all be underground. And so it gets very, very complex, So people would say, everything is allowed in this space. And the next thing out of their mouth would be, let's only speak from our higher selves. And I'd be like, my God, 90% of my experience has just been eliminated, So there are all these kind of interesting weavings of safety and psychological manipulation and egalitarianism, but people who really held a lot more power. And so these things are very tricky to be clear and clean about. And, so a lot of the practices that spend a lot of time in just embodiment, where there's not so much cognitive or psychological complexity, help liberate that also.
Just to sort of backtrack a little bit, and why do you think these practices or this concept is so important?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's important because, first of all, I think there's an evolutionary part to this. I think we're doing the practices because as a species, we're changing. I mean, we have never really been, we've always been more social beings that have been pre-constituted by the collective, with these structures in us. And only recently are we realizing that we can be autonomous individuals without being atomistic. So like these are words on your channel, like sovereign. If I'm sovereign and you're sovereign, then we have the advantage of diverse perspectives. We have the advantage of unique, diverse perspectives. So as a scanning collective, we're much more powerful. But then how do we put the collective intelligence back between that, So we want to integrate both of those. We want to integrate the power of unique perspective, the power of people with skills and talents that not everyone has, with the power of collective sense making, because then I think what you have is a problem solving methodology that we actually need to address the kinds of complex problems that matter to us today. I think that's the only kind of dynamic system that will actually solve the pickles that we're in.
I was reminded of Robert Kegan's work when you were talking there, of the idea of the socialized mind, this kind of evolution from the socialized mind where we're very much imbued with the values of our culture and living those out in a sort of more programmed way, to the self-authoring mind. And are you talking about something beyond the self-authoring mind?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I know a lot of friends who I would say, they're all developmental stage theorists. They're all certified in a lot of the tests, and some of them are pioneers. And I would say that most of them have self-authoring minds. I don't know, we can stop there. But it's really hard for them to act as a team. It's really hard work for them to reclaim this teamship. So we're not talking about experts. Experts are notoriously hard to get to talk together. We're talking about generalized intellects at the self-authoring stage who don't necessarily have the fluidity, or we don't have the capacities or immediate skill set to go beyond being what I would call individual contributor. So, and so these are the experiments that I ended up doing for 5 years here and learned the hard way. Yeah, but I think that, we learned some really cool things about working at that level. One of the things we learned is that there's a certain point at which the psychological processing, you know, that stage when you're trying to get rid of your own subjective structures and your own limiting structures, there's a point at which that work can go two ways. One, it can get exhausted because you're just done. I mean, I've sat in groups that are fantastically imaginative, and we get into all these metaphysical realms, and it's almost like someone will open their eyes and everyone at the same time will go, holy fuck, you know, because we all thought the same thing at the same time. But those realms are infinite. And I think this might be how some of the fantastic mythologies actually came through, because you start acting like as a collective intelligence and you freed yourself from even conceptual structures, and it gets very, very imaginative. But there was no purpose associated with it. We all agreed to disband and try to take this and apply it to action in the world. And in that, we found that the action piece is actually a significant complement to the work. Like if you have a group that does have a purpose, you can actually work on these intersubjective limitations much more effectively than if you're just trying to work on them directly. So a clear purpose, and really a lot, you know, this is, you know, if you're a team with a work purpose, even if it's ordinary work, you can really work on these human potentials because you have a clear worldly impact or worldly aspect to it. So my current work is, people call it guildcraft, or, you know, and it's all about creating community with kind of a work or a creative purpose at the center of it. And so that's one way it can go. And the other place it can go is, I think that sometimes the people who are primarily focused on these psychological structures, the psyche itself is infinite. And so there's a point at which people create new structures and then try to deconstruct them, and these things go on forever. So I just want to mention that because there is a trap in some of these communities where it's almost kind of like appealing to have a never-ending list of interpersonal problems to deal with when you show up all the time. So this notion of knowing when to move to what Ria Beck calls from the circle of presence to the circle of creativity. When do you have to go from working on your individual to, as a group, working in the world and bringing some of this early capacity, leveling up in the process? So that's kind of where my work is at this point, and a lot of it's in organizations because there's that work aspect. You know, you don't have to pretend that there's a purpose involved, and it becomes less about ego, less about me, and more about we. And in this sense, I say that the definition of a we is when the group becomes the unit of agency, right? So a team is a we, but a political party is not a we, because it's more of a us, it's more of an identity, right? So how do we take this work and get to the point where it itself as a group, the dynamics in the collective become a more powerful we that can transform, then that can be taken and transform the structures outside of society. And what you see is people then don't go after the structures. They tend to try to co-create emergent structures from within the society. What happens is that whole activist orientation to going out there and toppling something becomes, what can we, from the power of the space, through these collective insights, build and just have that seed something new. So you kind of see, you don't see it reemerge as a more powerful activist coalition. You see it emerging like a lot of the people that are on your podcast and and your YouTube channel, they're kind of switched to co-creating something new through collective insight rather than running out in the world and attacking the existing structures.
Can you give an example of what problems or what situations you think are particularly suited for this kind of way of working, and what are not particularly well suited to it?
Okay, so I think two that are particularly well suited for it are economics. You know, it's terribly hard. One of the limiting structures is, what is an economy without a global currency? What is an economy without currency that can be traded? What is, you know, so we have a lot of, it's really, really hard. I've worked with groups sitting here trying to solve that. And you constantly catch yourself, like you use the term gift economy, but then you're like, well, when does it come back? And oh, that's just a transactional exchange, you know, so really trying to figure out what is an economy outside of what we've always thought of as an economy. You know, it's just like in the, you know, before people could see outside their religion, it was just a given. And we think, oh, you know, they're so silly. How couldn't they have just not seen it? But it's the same thing. It's very hard to see outside production in an economy, or production in a neoliberal global conglomerate or something. So I think people are working on that. You know, I know the people in Holochain, part of their process is similar to collective insight practice or circling. You know, they use a lot of those technologies to constantly try to make sure they don't lapse into malware, you know, that the malware doesn't slip in. So economics is one, and then governance. You know, what's governance in a post-nation or post-state world? The trick in collective insight practice is you have to invite other perspectives in, because if you only have your own perspectives, then it's really hard to come up with any kind of new angles. But if you invite other perspectives in, and everyone's learned how to have really good conversations, then it's like when you're going over a problem in your own mind and you're coming up with outside the box ideas, well, you let others people's minds also fill that kind of platform. You know, it becomes a collective interweaving, a collective exploration of ideas that we don't know yet.
Yeah, there was, what first excited me about the potential of the kind of intellectual dark web idea was watching Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein on having a discussion about, and I think some of the lines were something like, those who are certain need to be silent. Like we need, and we know that almost all of the ideas we have will fail. We know that the socialist, the libertarian, the capitalist, all of these ideologies, all of these fixed methods are going to fail, and we know why they're going to fail. So therefore, we need something new. So I think that was a really exciting kind of, I think it was one of the first times I'd heard that expressed in a really public forum like that. So it sort of felt like there was a possibility for this level of conversation to really rise up. I mean, we've put a few pieces out recently asking whether that kind of promise was fulfilled with that conversation. I'd argue that it probably hasn't been. But if we're looking for, and you also sketched out the idea that we need lots of different perspectives. Are there some perspectives that we cannot include? Is there a sort of trap of inclusivity?
Okay, it's a very good question.
How do we know who is able to have a generative conversation and who isn't, I guess?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And I'm going to tell a story, back up, kind of disentangle from this thickness, and then we'll pursue it. So when I was doing research on this stuff, I discovered this very strange book called Synectics. And it was what T groups is to circling, I would say synectics is the collective insight practice. And it was this weird um, um, exercise or practice developed by these people, I can't remember who they were, in the 40s and 50s. And they were product designers. I mean, they were all men. It was like, you know, at that time. And they were creating products like thermoses. And, you know, they would try to design a better seal or a better way for the thermos not to occupy so much space. So they were, you know, pretty practical business. And this one guy, like, he must have been a psychologist or something, he got the idea that he would take his top designers and they would go out to a camp. You know, they would get out of their environment and they would be in nature where they could think more creatively. And so what happened was the camping situation got more and more sophisticated. So they would have to have the secretaries, you know, bring the food and pack all the things they would need, and the secretaries would come along to help support it. And eventually the secretaries started sitting in on the brainstorming, and they would say things like, wow, when you get mad like that, you're just like my niece. And my niece is always mad like that because of her like freaking, you know, or washing machine. And at first people would like, you know, they're secretaries, that's all they can contribute. But something they said would stir something in one of the designers. Like he's got a lot of the transcripts. And so someone said washing machine, and one of the designers started using his body like a washing machine and be like, yeah, like what? And so these weird kind of like peripheral perspectives would act as evocative ideas or phrases or evocative objects in the space, you know? And so there was this whole cult kind of, they had to go and build a department and nobody knew what they were doing over there because it got to be like a big secret because they were designing with this really weird way of using kind of like these spontaneous impulses or intuitions or felt senses from the secretary. So then, you know, later on, people got really interested in the idea of these felt senses and these, what I call sophisticated, naive questions entering the space. So I think all perspectives are valuable. And some of the juice in this work is when a perspective comes in and it irritates you. But the person sitting there adding these perspectives has to be able to be authentic and not be strategizing their belonging needs, let's say, in the group, because then it won't be this authentic kind of spontaneous, who knows why someone said that. And a lot of times in these groups, someone will say something, they'll say, I don't know, I'm just going to say it. But there's like a cloud in the sky. And people would be like, oh, we know what that is. And then it goes around and around. And then a little, maybe the next day, someone will say, the cloud in the sky. That's what the meaning is, because we're thinking of the thing like a solid state. And it's really, if we expand the concept of the mental model to some kind of phase state. And so this is why I call it really seems remarkable, because it's really like when you think on a problem and then you go to sleep and your dreams serve you up all these potential ideas that don't seem to make sense, and then it can come back together. So it's this way, it's a real collective, co-creative, imaginative intelligence. And so all these kind of strange ideas and irritations, like we worked with a group once, and one of the top people, we were all like, onto this model we liked so much, and this one person, he was still a holdout. He's like, yeah, I'd like to go with you, but I'm just getting madder and madder. So this is a way of understanding that even the negative feelings are trying to manifest some other potential in the space. But of course, this person had high capacity to say that and not be worried how it was going to live in the space, you know, and so we all honored that, and we ended up the next day getting some clarity around some of the assumptions we had been making. So that to me is collective insight practice. I think that I think as a species, you know, we don't know how to do this yet, really. Obviously, I hadn't tackled any, we haven't fixed any huge world problems, but I really feel that the capacity for something emergent is really coming online fast.
Mm. And for example, Jamie Wheel, who we've talked to quite a few times, says that where he sees this, and I don't know if you'd say that the word coherence is interchangeable with collective intelligence in this context, but where he sees it emerging, it's a very unstable element that seems to be breaking down very fast, which he finds very concerning. Would you agree with that? Do you have the same perspective?
No, actually, I had a little conversation about this notion of coherence in these practices recently. And so I think that the term coherence has something to do with these practices. But I think that if you think it, when I hear Jamie Wheel talk about it, he always then follows this word, how do we cohere at scale? And I think that's the trap. That's the old humanity and some kind of big globalized coherent wholeness one thing. So I think coherence is far from equilibrium. It's by definition a destable, or, you know, it's a temporary stability. And I think, these systems need to cycle through stages of instability and stability and coherence at different levels. And there's a real chance that all true coherence is local. And this has to do with entropy and how coherent systems have to actually increase entropy in the global scene, blah, 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 where you're talking about complexity. So then you can start to look at collective insight practice, say, okay, well, that tendency to think of global coherence or coherence at scale, let's put that aside. Now what's possible if we say coherence only happens locally? What difference does that make? And then what's possible? And when you do that, a whole new way, a whole new paradigm starts to open up. And so that's the distinction I would make with Jamie. And one of the, there's no evidence for this. It's all very theoretical. But one of the things we do know, and Jamie's been part of that Flow project, is teams. When you do physical things, you can get this coherence, right? But again, it's local. It's local sometimes to a team, sometimes to just one or two players on a team. And so there's reason to believe that if we reconceptualize coherence as local, that local coherence that seeds like downstream some creative effects, then I think we're outside of a pickle, or the way he's made an impossible inquiry in some way. That's my response anyways. Does it make sense? Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And what causes these states to break down? What are the sort of failure factors for the collective insight practice?
I wouldn't use the term breakdown. The thing is, why do we need these states to decohere? Because that's only when they decohere do they become action plans and things that you do in the world. And now the world is going to kick back, right? And you can't have a group of people that sit around and then cohere the physical cosmos with their central, so it's kind of like coherence. Then you have a new paradigm, you go out into the world, you see it different, the world brings back information, you come back with it. There's a whole exchange of and this is happening, the electron is cohering and decohering all the time in phase spaces. So when you look at this stuff from a complexity science, you can get really comfortable with things decohering and seeing it as not only necessary systems property, but something that is actually advantageous.
I'm thinking specifically about something like Jordan Greenhall's concept of sovereignty,
Mm-hmm.
that we can only really enter into this sort of creative relationship with each other when we've established our own sovereignty, when we've established our own ability to self-regulate and to do the work ourselves, before we can enter into these sort of generative experiences. Is that a failure condition, or is that a sort of necessary precondition for these kind of practices?
Yeah, so for collective insight practice, it's a necessary precondition. I used to write, you have to be individuated to participate, you know? I mean, unless you're just recreating the old structures, you know? So, so that's a whole other thing, you know? What's the difference between individuated sovereign people in a collective space versus social communal collectivism, right? And so it just ups the ante, because we want the autonomous perspective, we want the uniqueness, we want the sovereignty of the person, but we want it to be able to cohere so the intelligence is accelerated, or not even in terms of velocity, but the intelligence that's capable is really levels up to a different level. But that would still be local coherence. You know, so if you didn't cohere, you would have all meaning would stay open forever, and you would continually make and create meaning, but you know, the convergence onto a plan, or the convergence onto meaning making that you're going to try out in the world, these are all decoherent states, because now you hold that and the rest of the world hasn't participated in that. So there's a local coherence, but then a new kind of interface where that's going to retest itself. And every time you add new people in, there'll be more perspectives and more meaning making. And so it's kind of like stars being born in one of those star nurseries, you know, the thing has to blow apart to make new seeds. And so I just think that the need for the whole world to be coherent, at some level, the cosmos is coherent. That's a given. We don't have to help the cosmos along. It's how to achieve these human scale goals. And you know, what's the optimum scale for that is an interesting question.
And you mentioned in the message you sent me that collective insight practice is very hard to do. Why is it so hard to do?
Yeah, so just the first capacity we need is these to resolve these social conditionings, the socialized self. So for example, a big one, belonging needs. You can't do collective insight practice if you have belonging needs to belong to the group, because those needs, those lower level desires and affects will prejudice how you perform, right? So we don't want to change our practices to assuage people's belonging needs. We want people to reflect on these psychological structures that are imputed. A belonging need is deeper than social conditioning. It's a psychological schema, primary psychological schema. You know, it's part of the individuation process. So that's why collective insight practice is hard. You can start with that one. It's really hard for people to get beyond that. It's really hard for people to get out of the schemas of authority or roles or autobiographical coherence. You know, if I have a psychological structure, that makes me really important for me to have autobiographical coherence. This is going to limit my participation. I call it gatekeeping. I'm not going to let it out into the state.
Could you explain that? I'm not sure I understand what that means, autobiographical coherence, in this context.
So we can track the primary psychological structure of people over time. And so at one point, people's primary psychological need is for belonging, and then the next need is the role, you know, so the father and the guy who goes to work. These are more 50s and 60s. Today, one of the primary psychological structures people have, so you become self-authoring. What are you authoring? Your biographical narrative. Now that becomes very precious to you. It becomes another limiting structure. So with people who are self-authoring, one of the things you're working on is to show them that the self-authoring phase liberates, but be careful that you don't want coherent autobiographical narrative, because it's not true. We reconstruct that narrative retrospectively. So this will stop you.
Is that just so that I understand? Is that we end up starting to condition our behavior based on a story that we tell ourselves about who we are, and that becomes a limiting factor
to collective insight practice, because you'll be limited to that. So that's why it's really hard. It really.
Well, I'm kind of reminded of, and this may be a bad example, but the dialogue between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
I got the sense Sam Harris is so identified with this new atheist position that the sense of an emergent kind of, any kind of coherence or a synthesis that I thought could be implicit in their perspectives was blocked because of that, in my view.
Perfect example. Thank you. So you see, we know we intuit that they're highly functioning. They don't have simple belonging needs. They're not polarized people, but they are dependent on preserving, this autobiographical coherence. So this is another powerful structure. It's one of the last ones. Well, unless humans build more in between, but that's another. So all these needs, you work on one, and then you get, from Keegan's model you develop, but then the needs get replaced. They're usually easier and easier. The deeper needs are the hardest ones because they're more primal.
I think this is such a key point, this autobiographical coherence, especially when you have any kind of public profile, for example, like this sense of, and this again, going back to the sort of the concept of the intellectual dark web, when I spoke to Brett Weinstein at the beginning, he said, all truths must reconcile, I think. And there was this sense of, wow, okay, we've got sort of Jungian psychology over here with Jordan Peterson. We've got deep sort of evolutionary biology over here with Brett Weinstein. Actually, there is a place where they seem to link, because there's a concept of the shadow, and then we've got the fact that we've got all of these kind of murderous desires that are conditioned by evolution. There was a sense of, wow, this could actually be a synthesis of all these interesting minds. But what I think I've seen play out is that all of these people with a public profile and with a position to defend are then so identified with that. It's very difficult then to enter into a dialogue where you would have to give up some of that autobiographical coherence to enter into a new space.
Exactly. So I think
this is a really key point.
It is key, and it's key for people that are doing this work, because they're usually somewhere in that kind of late stage psychological structure. I just want to say, in case they're watching, they also have a job, and they also are performers in a certain way. We don't know if they drop that in I suspect some of them can drop that in more intimate groups, in more local coherent groups, right? Sure. But that's certainly a great example of how it can be sticky widget, this notion of autobiographical coherence. And I mean, I teach a whole course on how the structures change in evolutionary development of the self. And most of the people I teach are right there. You can hear in my students, they'll switch to talking about the story they tell, and then they start to get very uncomfortable because they can tell, well, I could tell that story this way, and sometimes I tell it that way. And then they start looking for authenticity, authentic self. Like, what is the authentic self? It's not even the one who self-authors. You know, it's like you've been snookered all along, and now what is it? You know, and they discovered that the authentic self doesn't have, it's not a psychological structure at all, right? So it's an evolutionary process, or an evolutionary moment in time. So these, once you get to these distinctions, then retrospectively you see how and why emotions and some of the ways you work with emotions earlier on in we-space practice were actually also limiting. Because you tend, in many of these practices, we tend to accommodate needs, psychological needs of people. And we, by doing that, we're actually limiting the potential liberation of that person, right? So, so that's when you get into these spaces where people do less of that, and the more the energy is allowed to enter. But of course, the more arousal in the space, the more difficult some of these dynamics are to be present with. So it's always really tricky. So what does it look like? It looks like people, well, in my case, it's more powerful when it's in a nice setting, like my studio. I mean, you could do it in organizations, but a nice setting in nature is important. It's also very important and more powerful if you're on site continuously for at least 3 days, and you eat and you sleep and you play together. Now, it creates exhaustion, but in the early part of the practice, you want people to be exhausted, because then they don't hold on so much to what they know, and they get into this place where eventually they just like, whatever, you know, they're too tired, the organism's too tired to structure itself. And a lot goes on outside of when we're actually sitting in formal practice, which is just sitting around together with a time stamp, either enduring or enjoying what comes up. So that's what it looks like. I mean, I have certain techniques that I do to short circuit some of these processes now. They're, you know, they are techniquey. But I'll just give you one of them, and maybe you can do with it what you want. But it's called reverse Bohmian dialogue. So Bohmian dialogue is people sit around in circle practice, and you only want to contribute something that's really valuable, or carries the conversation forward, or that is in service to other people, or however it's set up. And at a certain point in some of the repeated or sessions I've done with novice practitioners, if they get over the hump the first day, by the middle of the second day, I say, let's practice reverse Bohmian dialogue, which means everything that comes up in your mind, you're just going to speak. No more gatekeeper self. Like, you know, we'll get an idea and then, well, I'm not going to say that. Or we'll get an idea and, oh, maybe I should hold off. Or we'll get an idea and we strategize, you know. So we agree, and you have to have everybody literally, orally commit to doing it. Because if one person holds out, it's just not good. But if you can get agreement, and we timestamp it, so like 3 minutes, to give people the confidence that they can endure this, because all they're thinking is, oh my God, what's going to come out of my mouth? And what they realize is something truly miraculous. When you don't gatekeep the thoughts, they do not become disingenuous, and they do not become false, and they do not become arrogant or strategizing. That is an amazing thing. Like, most of this, what you realize is the whole process of keeping your thoughts in a loop in yourself is what creates the damage, not the fact that you're saying it. The fact that it creates damage is because you're saying things that you've looped in your own mind. But the spontaneously speaking self, with some kind of minimal agreement to be authentic, is actually a wonderful thing. And that's a big learning. That's a big insight.
No filter.
The right timing.
Yeah, probably not a live TV interview.
So that's kind of the territory that is, that I'm looking. It's been slow. I haven't done a lot of it lately because I think that some of these challenges, like work that's being done in many places, are really starting to build communities that can that have capacity to move on to maybe some of these more difficult kinds of practices.
And that's probably a good place to ask, what are you hopeful about? Where do you feel that the field is at now, and where do you think it's going, and what are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful about people making these distinctions. At first, the field was, whoa, like nobody knew what they're really trying to do. Everybody started off kind of with assumptions that were not necessarily helpful. And where do I want it to go? Well, I would like to see more of this kind of work being brought into high-level teams and organizations. In some organizations, versions of it are happening anyways. The way some really high-level teams are worked together synergistically. They're not doing it methodologically, but they've worked through a lot of these challenges. If people who have a wicked problem are already a team, are already a group, it would be great if there was some way in which they would find themselves connected to people who could level them up to maybe something more like collective insight practice. So start with people who are already working pretty well on a wicked problem that they're very, very vested in. See if we can get some local coherence going.
Great.
Yeah.
And there's one other question that I'd like to ask that's sort of come up, and that's, is there a gender difference in this? I mean, you used a really interesting example before about the kind of executives and the secretaries. Obviously, that's in a kind of 1950s or 1960s context. But I mean, it's a simple fact that most of the people we've interviewed on our channel around this topic so far have been men. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm just not aware of the number of women in this field, but is there a gender difference? Are there more men involved? Because it would seem to me that a lot of the more intuitive awareness of the kind of the group space is something that women are more sensitive to than men, but there are a lot of more high profile men in this area.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have a long history with that. When I first started doing this, there were people that I was working with that were convinced only women could do this work. That was before the distinction between the circle of presence and the circle of creativity were made. So women have a lot more patience and endurance for the circle of presence. Men tend to have more creative energy, but you can't really bypass you can't bypass reclaiming these other capacities. So that was originally how it was kind of flushed out. But I don't really believe that anymore. Women, see, there's a stage at which you have a psychological structure, and you can call it an internal working model. And women's internal working models are different than men's, but they're both internal working models, and the way to resolve them are the same. So the fact that they manifest differently is not important, and we spend too much time at that level. When we see they're actually the same and they limit us in the same way, and where we're going to doesn't have that fault line anymore, then you just get over with it. Once people can understand that, then, so women have belonging needs, men have ranking needs. They have to rank each other. I happen to be a ranker. That's why I'm on these podcasts, and other women aren't, okay? Because there you go. But when you understand it as the psychodynamic...
Can you unpack that? Why does that make a difference?
Because in social space... In terms of your profile. Because I like this kind of sporty intellectual game, and I don't care if I belong to your tribe or not. So you guys like those kind of people, right? So we can all be very happy we are rankers, but it's just as limiting as a belonging need in the other typology. So it took me a long time when I understood this typology, it was really liberating for me. But if you understand the psychodynamics of psychological structure schemas, you'll see that they come at the same stage of development, the same attributes. And so you actually see, instead of talking about, oh, your belonging needs, or you say, oh, here's our structure again. Let's understand it. It's all the same. So you see underneath, that's the same dynamic. So that's how I understand it now. And all my insight groups have been at least 40-60 or 60-40. And I'm kind of proud of that, because I think the dynamics are really cool when that happens. That's not to say there shouldn't be separate groups, because they're also very valuable. But I've been fortunate to have a lot of that diversity, and had to we had to look at that. This distinction actually came out in insight practice.
That sounds like a fascinating distinction.
Yeah.
So how do we get more women on our podcast?
I don't know. I don't know.
Is that something we should be aiming for, in your view?
I think it's something you should be aware of, and the awareness itself lends itself to more positive behavior. But I wouldn't do anything to morph your podcast. What I'd like to see is women doing more podcasts. I mean, I've been asked to do podcasts, but I'm not a podcast person, but I don't know. I don't know how to really answer that. I don't feel the need for women to be on the kind of podcasts that they don't want to be on, or to make podcasts that they don't want to do. But I think it's important in all these groups, and to your credit, all these groups where there's mostly men, integral community, videos I'm on, same thing. There's a open awareness that there's a lack of female representatives, and there's an ongoing search space without defensiveness to support more women. But I don't have a problem that it just falls out the way it does. That would be a whole, I don't want, you can see I don't want to get into that whole conversation, but I don't see that onus is on the side of the person doing the podcast, if in fact they keep asking questions like that, or are genuinely open to, we don't attract that. Slowly keep that in mind until a natural way of doing that happens. But if you go overboard and it's an overcorrection, then it just goes into shadow. Now you have the opposite problem. So it's a little bit of a pickle there.
Yeah, for sure. But this has been really, really wonderful, Bonnie. Thank you very much for making the time. I think it's a very timely subject, and I think this is a very, very interesting contribution. So thank you very much.
Making the time. Have a good night, David.
Rebel Wisdom is a new sense-making platform, bringing together the most rebellious and inspiring thinkers from around the world. If you're enjoying our content, then you can help us make more by becoming a subscriber, which will give you access to a load of exclusive films. Also, you can then join our group Zoom calls to discuss the ideas in the films, and you can send us ideas for questions for upcoming interviews. We're also looking for talented people to help us out with editing, graphics, music, that kind of thing. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll know we talk a lot about the value of embodying or actually living out the ideas that we talk about. So that's why we run regular events in London. Check out the links on the website for more. And hope to see you soon.